everybody for being here. What a great turnout. It's so nice. My name's Parker Kay. I run the Toronto-based gallery Pumice Raft. Pumice Raft has been, thank you, my fans. Pumice Raft has been hosting exhibitions, screenings, off-site programmings, and public programs like today since 2019.
And I'm Chris Mendoza, an artist and educator based here in Toronto, whose work often materializes in installations, performances, and public programs. As I've collaborated with Parker many a time now, often engaging with site as a means to interrogate place. Just before we get started, we want to do a big shout out and thank you to Cosmo Dean and Trevor Wheatley, who run Top Projects, the space we're in. Thanks to both of you for your generosity and for making space for arts and culture in a city that is, as we have discussed and will discuss, is very difficult often. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Cosmo and Trevor. It's amazing. Also, just wanted to articulate that in addition to the conversations that we'll have today, today's event is also a launch for the 3rd issue of Le Chauffage magazine, which is a magazine based between Brussels and Vancouver, co-run by Felix Rapp, who's here and part of one of our panels today. So there are copies of the 3rd issue. They're $30 each. They're available. We'll kind of turn into more of a mingling launch after today's event. Today is the 2nd event of the Undercurrents Forum. Our aim with this forum is to investigate the notions of the public, the private, and the commons, and how geographical politics underlie them, and how they impact the arts, be it through the sites where art takes place, funding, the form and role of institutions, or artist professionalization and practices. In framing this as a forum, it has been important for us to bring together a multiplicity of voices that we hope kind of continue to proliferate beyond today's discussions.
Yeah, and as the title of the event suggests, Undercurrents, Toronto's a city built on buried watercourses that have been filled in, paved over, diverted, and channeled, and which we might not always see flowing above ground, but which persists beneath our feet. The recent and recurring flooding of the Don Valley Parkway, for instance, is a good example of the way that despite how the water may be manipulated or managed for the city's development, it will find its way to kind of like return to its pathways. It also finds a way to kind of defy the logic and order of the city, which points to this kind of like palimpsest of histories and geographies.
Yeah, and behind us, there's a steep hill that kind of rises to the escarpment of St. Clair. And this marks the former shoreline of Lake Iroquois, a glacial lake that formed during the last ice age. And it kind of marks the history of Toronto's geography. The glacial melting took place somewhere between 11,000 and 13,000 years ago. These watersheds formed rich pockets for fishing, pottery, and agriculture for indigenous people who have been here on this land for at least 5,000 BCE. This includes the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who actively have shaped this land prior to colonial settlement and continue to shape and resist the present city.
Following the colonial establishment of the city by English settlers at the end of the 18th century, the landscape quickly transformed into an industrialized landscape to obviously conform to industrial production. And this marked an intense phase of manipulation and changing, which is obviously what we see with the case of like the rivers and waters that flow above and underground in Toronto. But there are also other flows that kind of illustrate the flow of capital and the relationship of kind of the urban environment to those circuits, which for instance is the railway tracks right in back of us. And we'll probably hear the train kind of move through our space at least once or twice throughout this event. these, of course, this track, for instance, points to the forces of capital accumulation and colonial expansion, evoking exploitation of immigrant laborers from China, Hong Kong, and Europe, and the building of the nation state.
The legibility of these traces of capital accumulation and land extraction may fade as industrial architecture forms an aesthetic basis for the Geary Avenue we know today, one associated with culture, leisure, and soon-to-be home of the many neighboring condo developments. However, it's important to remember the lingering preconditions of this context.
And our first event really focused on these kind of real estate-led and private corporate-based interventions and development that have been actively shaping the city. And of course, with that, the changing and increased private funds that have also been impacting the arts in Canada. We had Vancouver-based curator Caitlin Jones come in to give a presentation on the fall of Artscape, and specifically her experience working as executive director for BCA, which was the kind of BC offshoot of Artscape. This context is endemic to a kind of paradigm of market and real estate-led development in cities, which often gets a label private-public partnership, but we see manifest through different layers of gentrification. Our second event, Foils, which is what you're all here for today, focuses on artistic, curatorial, and organizational practices that are both responsive to these aforementioned conditions, but also exist despite them. They're all in one way or another negotiating this present tension in cultural spaces today, being it the tightening of public funds, increasing individualism, or the lack of communal accountability. So in doing so, they act as varying foils to the current cultural paradigm.
And I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the practices and organizations that we're going to be talking about today, they don't exist as a given. For instance, I organized a panel discussion in 2017 at the Toronto Reference Library on the evolution of the Artist Run Center. And as part of the introduction for that event, I listed as many artist-initiated projects as I could think of or find. Some of those spaces include Franz Kaka, The Loon, Roberta Pellin, Mandan is here today, Little Sister, 811, Bunker 2, Younger Than Beyonce, Carrier Arts, AC Repair Co., DuPont Projects, Towards, Crutch, X-Space, The Table, G Gallery, Pool House, Howard Park Institute, Warner Gallery, Garden Avenue, Weird Things, and Push Me, Pull You. I think what's interesting is that a lot of those names might not sound so familiar to us here in 2024. Some have become kind of more solidified and have lasted, but a lot of them are no longer in operations. And I think that that points to the kind of ephemeral nature of artist-initiated work, that value is not necessarily centered in longevity or stability. It's more free-flowing, flexible, and I produced this map, which is on the Pumice Raft website, which kind of shows you the shape of the arts ecology in Toronto. The yellow spaces are spaces that no longer exist, and then there's kind of artist-initiated commercial galleries, et cetera. But I think the politics of making things visible is a kind of a secondary aim of this event. Naming things, verbalizing things is an important way for these smaller projects to live on in parallel or in defiance of more entrenched institutions in the city. So I think that's an important kind of point to start with.
And to sort of also reflect the kind of range of cultural practice, we really wanted to make this panel, or these set of panels, as like pan-Canada as possible. So we do have folks who have worked in other provinces, other cities, and some folks who are coming in also from outside of Toronto. And we also wanted to have an intersection of folks who really work across not just being an artist or curator, but are obviously also taking on administrative or organizational jobs, or even just day jobs, to understand the kind of nexus that a lot of us working in the arts are currently living. I'll do it, yeah. So I'm sure as you walked in, you all noticed the 3 cameras. We are recording this for posterity, but also there is a live stream. Don't worry, none of you are in the live stream. So that will just to note that's there. Jordan and Miles are manning that, and also Adrian will be doing a score for us, which will kind of was what was running when we first walked in, and we'll cut through the kind of intermissions between the panels. And then Brittany's also around taking some photos, so just kind of letting folks know that. And just a quick rundown, we're doing 3 panels that are each going to be 40 minutes, and we'll have a kind of really tight 10-minute break in between each of them. We're going to hold off on Q&A, though, for each panel. So instead of kind of the typical format, we're just going to do a big 9-person Q&A at the end. So it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be great. And that'll open it up so folks can ask anyone who's presented any questions. So like if you do have a notepad or something, or you have a notes app, you can write your questions down as they come up. And it'll also be a chance for the panels to kind of like cross-question each other. So I think that's it.
That's it.
Okay.
We're just going to get right into it and start with our first panel. So we're going to sit down here. So we'd like to welcome to the stage Theresa Wang, Director of Mercer Union, Lillian O'Brien Davis, curator at the recently opened Goldfarb Gallery at York University, and Yasmin Nurming-Por, co-director of 272. Come on up. So as Chris mentioned, each panel kind of focuses through one thematic question. The question for this panel is, what is the role of curatorial work in reimagining organizational structures? So Lillian, I just mentioned that the Goldfarb Gallery just opened, so maybe we'll start with you. You're the curator of collections and contemporary art engagement at the Goldfarb, an institution that just opened and is affiliated with a university. Your position straddles the often private world of collections with the public world of programming. I'm curious if you think do you see these as distinct domains separate from each other, or how do you envision them as more interrelated?
Cool. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so my title is Curator of Collections and Contemporary Art Engagement, and it's a fairly new role. So if you're familiar with what was formerly known as the Art Gallery of York University, which has like a really long, rich history as an organization that sort of is a university gallery in name, but was sort of path-breaking in terms of community engagement, like has a really long record of working with the like Jane Finch community, doing Jane Street Speaks, and sort of essentially ignored its collection for many decades. And then as we were becoming the Goldfarb Gallery, my position sort of came into existence. Liz Akiriko had the role before me for about 1.5 years, so it's only about 2 or 3 years old at this point. And one of the stipulations for the Goldfarb Gallery, which is a brand new freestanding building that just opened on Wednesday night, and then a visible vault. So the idea that the collection that's been part of the gallery holdings since the 1970s would have a like more presence on campus and be accessible to students and researchers, and not really the public, because I don't want to be a tour guide. But if you're a member of the public who's interested, send me an email. And so, yeah, so my role kind of straddles collections and then this sort of like vague contemporary art engagement, which I'm not really sure how that was envisioned when they created the role, but yeah, of course I see them as kind of linked and interrelated. I think as a curator, I've worked within institutions as well as like larger institutions as well as sort of artist-run centers. Briefly went independent for like 3 months. But working within collections, I think I'm seeing sort of like a part of my role that I'm really excited about and really passionate about, in terms of kind of like reckoning with this like accumulation of things and trying to think about them in 2024 and like through my lens. And yeah, I think it's sort of an in-process situation. I mean, I did a project with my colleague Clara Halpern called Uncontainable Collections, The Speculative Future of Objects, which launched in the fall. It's a podcast series, and we did a series of conversations with an assortment of artists and curators and writers, kind of thinking about different futurisms and how they intersect with collecting or collection practices. And that was sort of like my first opportunity to think generally about the role of collections within, I don't know, contemporary discourse. So that's one instance I'm trying to kind of piece together a bit more to share. Yeah, I think in terms of how I envision the future of the collection, like, I don't know, let's talk about it. Like, York doesn't have, or like, the Goldfarb Gallery does not have a large budget for acquisitions. So we do not acquire work through purchases, and we probably won't for a really long time. And so right there, we do not kind of think of ourselves within the framework of expansion. So like, we are physically expanded. We have 3 galleries now. We can do more shows throughout like the course of a year. We're physically expanded. The works that we have in our collection like have more space and can be like treated with more respect. But in terms of expanding the like number of works is something that will be very slow and very sort of like methodical. And not all of my colleagues are that interested in the idea of like expansion as the only way to like change the face of a collection, which is a kind of like, I think it's like the easiest answer, where it's like, oh, the collection only has like white dudes in it. It's like all abstract painting, like yawn, okay, like how do we change that? It's like, oh, we acquire a bunch of like black photographers, and it's like, that doesn't really remedy very much. And it's sort of, you know, it has its role, but I don't think it has like, it doesn't address the kind of like deeper gaps. And I think about something that my professor, the famous Barbara Fisher, once said, where she was like, if your goal is to like fill holes, like what are you like essentially what are you doing, or like what is the purpose of that? And like me and my cohort were like, ew, yeah, we don't want to do that. And so it's sort of like, what are the other approaches? And so some of the other approaches that I'm interested in would be like reinterpreting what we have. So like a curator that I really admire, Crystal Mowry, talks about how at like the Kitchener-Waterloo Gallery, some of the projects that they've done, for instance, with Deanna Bowen, who I've also worked with, means like looking at works that you have in the collection. I think, and in the case that Crystal was talking about, it was like a Lauren Harris work. And instead of like deaccessioning it or buying a different work to kind of like pretend that that work matters less, you sort of like rewrite the didactic material and you update the accessioning information, so you can kind of like expand the framework for that work. So that's something that's like, you know, that's another approach, I think, and one that sort of like can be within like my capacity as like someone whose role is like, I don't really have like a team, it's just me. I think also inviting artists to like think about the work that I have in the collection, you know, like having collaborative conversations. One of the artists that I collaborate with the most, Nick Wilson, like we've, you know, spoken in depth about the collection and be like sort of like what do you as a practicing artist like think about this? Like, is this of interest to you like at all? And for him, like the answer is like yes. and like, why don't I give you some of my work, and like that way I don't have to destroy it, I can like have it stored instead. But also this idea of like thinking about, like, in the case of York University, we have a lot of like modernist abstraction in the collection. So like thinking about how to kind of like, I don't know, have an artist sort of like interpret that kind of work now, and move away from the kind of like machismo that like that kind of work projects. Yeah, I think I could go like on and on about this, so maybe we can have another collections-based panel, but hopefully that's like interesting for you folks.
Oh, there we go. It's interesting that you're talking about like different ways of balancing the diversity, for lack of a better term, of the collection through what you could call curatorial behavior rather than like curatorial output or equity through acquisitions. And that kind of makes me think about Mercer Union in terms of, you know, how do curators behave, or how do organizations behave beyond the scope of exhibition making. Personally, I think Mercer is such a gold star in terms of how an organization can orient themselves towards commission-based structure over kind of like the international cycle of exhibiting artworks. I also think that it kind of distances exhibition making from an exchange of goods or saleable objects. I would love to hear maybe your thoughts on, or the kind of ethos around the commissioning model, Theresa.
Yeah, thanks, Parker. I think that to talk about the commissioning model at Mercer Union, it's really important to understand the context and the history under which Mercer Union was first founded. Perhaps many of you here in the room today know, being familiar with Toronto artist-run culture history, Mercer Union was founded in 1979 by a group of 12 artists who were directly responding to the urgencies of the time that they had identified, namely that there did not exist a type of space dedicated to the exposition and presentation of experimental forms of contemporary art making beyond commercial and public galleries. That founding ethos, which really I think expresses the idea that there is a lack, there is an urgency, that there is a need to fill, is something that continues to inform the way that we work at Mercer Union. And it is the way at which we have arrived at developing and formalizing a commissioning model. We call this model Artist First, and the idea is that it really distills our mandate as an artist-run, artist-centered organization to support the long-term dialogue and to provide long-term forms of support and dialogue for artists, with artists, and also engaging with audiences around contemporary art. That idea of centering artists is the ethos under which Artist First was formed. And tying back what I mentioned about the need to respond to the current urgencies of the day, commissioning was something we arrived at because it was, first and foremost, a way Mercer Union had long operated. It was through the production and presentation of contemporary art, oftentimes working with artists to present ambitious milestone exhibitions, oftentimes providing artists with this opportunity to work in different ways, whether it was formally maybe engaging with new types of audiences, maybe engaging with new forms of discourse, and it felt like it was a very natural way for us to continued to grow. But of course, we were also responding to the needs of the artists at the time, and we formalized this in 2021, but you can really see the history of commissioning going back into our work. What we identified as urgencies were that artists needed a sustained way of having feedback and dialogue with curators, with institutions to develop new work. Artists needed new forms of financial support and access to institutional frameworks to obtain more financial support, because as much as it is important to foster forms of research and inquiry, we ultimately come to a place where we're needing the funds to realize those projects. I think what the commissioning model really affords us at Mercer Union is this ability to think about an exhibition for an entire life cycle. I think that, so I arrived at Mercer Union last August, so it's been about a year for me, and I've been able to experience that life cycle. I think what some people might find surprising about commissioning and the way that we do commissioning at Mercer Union is, I think the idea of commissioning feels like it's really about production, at arriving at something that you present. But we see commissioning as not only the production of, objects in space or, exhibitions, but also as the commissioning of knowledge. And when you frame it in that way, you're really able to work with artists, develop a long-term dialogue with them, and to support different cycles and different phases of the cycle of an artistic project. Sometimes they're more in a research and incubation phase. Sometimes they're in this part where they need to be presented within a discursive format and engage with audiences. The way that we run our exhibitions is one form of engagement with commissioning, but we also commission essays to accompany the exhibitions that we offer to artists, to offer to audiences to better understand where artists are coming from. So there's a publishing initiative. The public programs are also this other arm of the way that we work. So I guess that I think it really does come out of a curatorial ethos and idea around institutional behavior.
Am I audible? Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Sorry, that's also interesting to hear across both of your practices, this kind of curatorial behavior or curatorial ethic, that the production of work is, again, just not the product that goes out there, but also a kind of mode of engagement with an artist, with the discursive practice, with producing knowledge for public as well. Yasmin, you've held a number of institutional positions as well at the AGO, the Walter Phillips Gallery, Global Affairs Canada Visual Arts Collection, Image Festival, and Sheridan College. And now you're working in commercial sphere as one of the two co-directors of 272, kind of reflecting maybe off of what both Lillian and Theresa said and your own experience and now your experience in the commercial sphere. How do you see your role as curator kind of change between these two contexts? Or maybe that's acknowledging a difference too much in some ways as well.
I mean, there is a difference for sure, yeah. One of my favorite ways to answer this question is that, when you're in an institution, things might be your fault, but they're not always your problem. When you're running your own business, a gallery, it's probably your fault and it's definitely your problem. So, yeah, I spent about a decade working in institutions of different sizes, and I got to a point where I think I just realized that I missed doing what I love the most about this job, which is actually working with artists. And that led to a broader series of questions for myself, which is, what do I care about? What hills do I want to die on? And also, where is the work? And I think that that's, an ongoing question. When I think you're in institutions, actually, from my experience, the work is protecting the artist from the institution, especially when you're working with contemporary artists. Institutions are not really structured to work with someone who's changing their minds. Like, it's much easier to work with someone who can't talk back to you or change their mind or have a lot of feedback on interpretive material and installation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, estates are a different situation, but so I think, yeah, that, really kind of gave me a moment to reset and think, how do I start working with artists in a way in which I'm really getting to support their practices in a meaningful sense. And if you're an artist that I do a studio visit with, one of the first things I usually say is I want to get inside your brain. And that's definitely, I think, kind of the ethos of the way that I enjoy working. It's the time of working in a commercial gallery versus an institution is obviously very different. The last institutional exhibition that I worked on had a lead time of over 2 years and more than $500,000 in budget. And now I work on a timeline of sometimes less than a month and, no budget. So there's lots of different kind of realities and different kinds of like stressors to take into context, of course. But I think definitely the institutional work has been instrumentally important in the way I approach commercial practice. I think one of the best things that I learned about being in institutions is, not to be precious about writing and things like that. And it's funny because both, Theresa and Lillian are speaking as themselves, but they're also, they can speak on behalf of an institution. And then to think of myself and my partner in business, Emma, like, are we an institution? That's not like really a question I have an answer to, or something that maybe actually makes me feel really uncomfortable in terms of that power dynamic. But in addition to, having this, switch from the more public to commercial side of things, I have an independent practice. And if you were to look at kind of the list of even just locations of where those places are, Scott, who's in the audience here, we have collaborated on a project for the past couple years, which has taken us to both the Isle of Skye, to really remote areas of Ireland, but working on a show in Chile and another in Buffalo. I get to approach those in ways in which, maybe those don't look like commercial projects, or maybe sometimes they don't even look conventionally like art either. Or maybe question what art can look like. And those I can approach with way more, time and intention in a durational sense. So it's, I think that's where I'll leave it.
As we kind of touched on in our introduction, like, this program is very centered on, how the culture of the arts is influenced and influences land and space. As we were kind of putting the questions for this panel together, like, I was reflecting on the different ways that the three of you, the different relationships to space or place that you have. For instance, I know Mercer has kind of been listed for the building that Mercer is in has been for sale for a number of years. Lillian, the context of a university is fraught with its own politics. And Yasmin, I think it's really interesting that 272 kind of exists in my observation where you want your client, like, close to your clients in kind of Yorkville, Summerhill area. And I guess that just leads me to, I'm curious how you all kind of consider the politics of the spaces, the physical places that you work in, and how that kind of permeates into the work that you do. Whoever wants to jump in.
I have an easy answer to this question. I mean, absolutely, yeah, we're on the proximity of Yorkville. We can work to clients' houses, which is amazing. That's super convenient, but it was the cheapest place we found in the entire city. And I think that's like a reality also. We were looking at storefronts on places like St. Clair West. We wanted to be kind of in a hub with more of a community. So, but we just kind of faced the reality that, like, it was far more expensive to be up in the area that we thought we wanted to be. But then we serendipitously also just discovered that the space that we're in was a gallery in the 70s that had an international profile. Our next show in January will actually be engaging with that local history. But it's been really amazing to have folks come through who were, active in the scene during the 70s when, Yorkville was kind of like a grungier area of town. And it's been this like beautiful way that we've had this intergenerational connection between folks that would come in and say, it was a neon gallery mostly, so the gallery was black, and yeah, there was carpet everywhere. But it's really exciting to think, someone was having fun there in the 70s, and we have that kind of, it's a really idiosyncratic space also, it's not really a white cube.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think speaking from about Mercer Union has been at its current building by Boer and Lansdowne for 16 years, since 2008. And I think the way that I think about place and space as a curator, having worked in different skills and different types of institutions, both public and commercial and more independent spaces, is really about like the relationship that institution has to a community, and the types of audiences that come in as a result, and then your responsibility as a curator to interface with those types of publics. And Mercer Union, because it came to Boer and Lansdowne in 2008, it was one of the first organizations, if not the first, to be part of this, what we now understand to be this like arts hub, right, on Bloor West. And I think that, so to bring to connection like what you brought up, the building was listed for sale for a number of years. It was recently taken off the market, thankfully. But it informs the way we think about our relationship to our community. What has Mercer Union developed in connection to this community over these 15 years? In other words, like what do we have to show for it? And I think it's a critical approach, because the community that we have is largely artists, cultural practitioners, curators, but we also have a responsibility to a general public, because just because of the nature of real estate here in Toronto, that neighborhoods change, and we often have people coming into the gallery who are saying, I've lived here for however long, and this is my first time coming in, even on a high traffic place like Bloor West. And I guess, I think that because the building was put on, for sale, it made us think about our relationship to our community in a deeper way, made us think about ways in which we could behave, offer up our space, work with the community, solidify our relationship with our community in more meaningful ways. And then on another level, I guess how I think about my work as a curator in an institution is that the institutional framework offers tools for you as a curator, and not all curators have access to those tools. I certainly didn't in different roles that I've had before, but because of the nature of my role, which is a joint director and curator role, I have the immense privilege of being able to guide the organization's operational direction, strategic direction, following a curatorial mandate. So I really see the institutional framework, and the types of, arms or functions of the institution as tools that I can use as a curator to better support artists and perform my role in serving artists. So one of those tools is like for instance, governance practices between board and staff. How does the institution govern itself through policy, development and fundraising? How can you do that in a better way, more in service of artists? And then building is like, because the building was up for sale, we really tried to better understand what real estate development looked like here in the city, and it's really changed. It's really changed since the building was first put up for sale to the point that it is now. You know, we're in a housing crisis. We're finally at a point where politicians are trying to, I guess, at least address it. And that's opening up different forms of opportunity for nonprofit organizations. And so we're trying to tap into that, which is such a different language, you know, for someone who doesn't work in policy, doesn't really understand it, but I think is such an immense asset for us as curators to have, and we need to better understand the way things work on that level to can ensure that contemporary art can be sustained in this city. Yeah.
I have to talk about the university, the institution. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you know, universities are really big institutions. They are, you know, bastions of whiteness and wealth. And they steal your time, and they're a bureaucracy. Like, I think everyone in this room already knows all that. So do we think about that? Do my colleagues and I think about that when we do our work? Absolutely. I think, you know, one of the things that I admired about the AGYU when it was the AGYU was its commitment to community. And I think that's something that will like continue in our new life and in our new environment. But I think like having the Jane Finch community so nearby us is something that has kind of like distinguished our gallery. And so my colleague Alison Adley is sort of like, she's been at the gallery for 20 years. She has like generational friendships with the community, like within the community. They were at the opening, you know, like the Forum space. Like we have 3 galleries, and the 4th space in the new building is called the Forum, and it's a performance space. And so the idea that came into existence because of, you know, because our community is interested in performance, spoken word, and music, and so we needed to have space for that. So there's those kind of like physical manifestations that we kind of think about in the context of the university. You know, I think one of the kind of like pressure points within universities is like this question of like, do you show student work? Do you engage with faculty? Like how do you do that? And then how do you also have like a relationship to research? And I think like those kinds of questions are ones that we're grappling with a lot. Like, you know, showing student work, you know, people might have different opinions in terms of like, you know, there are other spaces for that on campus. So at the Goldfarb Gallery, we don't currently show any we don't do MFA shows. You know, if you know, like U of T does. So that is one distinction, but we acquire student work. And so instead of having a show, you get to have your work in our collection forever. So like there's those kind of like pinch points that we think about. So far, I think gallery administration has like historically, like not just our existing director, but our directors over the years have been resistant to having faculty curate because it kind of blurs the vision of the gallery and the direction of the gallery, and sort of like has it subsumed into the kind of like vision of the university, even though they're distinct because the gallery gets public money. But there are a lot of amazing faculty people on campus. So like it would be really interesting to have them work with us and stuff. So I don't know if this is really like a good answer to your question, but I think that's sort of one answer. The other thing that I was thinking about, which I sort of am like a bit more willing to talk about, is like the kind of like, I don't know, like the way that a curatorial project might like shift through space and place. When I curated the exhibition Conceptions of White, it opened in Regina, and the exhibition was looking at sort of like the manifestation of the idea of whiteness. And so when it opened in Regina, my co-curator, John Hampton, and I were like really nervous. We're like, how is like the local Regina community gonna react? And like the overall, like people were really interested and like really curious about the show, and it was like really positive. And then it toured and came to Toronto at the Art Museum, and like it was like generally like pretty interested audience. We got a couple wackos on Twitter like saying some stuff, the kind of usual suspects. And then it toured to Vancouver, and we got like decimated. Like, I don't know if anyone's from Vancouver. I think there's somebody here. But like Vancouver is possibly the most racist city in this country. Like, holy shit. Anyway, there's some angry people that saw that show, and like my God. And so like it was so interesting to kind of track, like the show itself didn't change at all, but like these like the context shift like changed the reception of the show so much. And that's something that, whether it was like ignorance or naivete, like I hadn't thought about. And I think it's definitely like influenced the way I think about projects now. And it's made me sort of like more cognizant of like how much when I'm in Toronto, like I'm in like a very specific context, and my work is sort of like among friends and among peers, and being read in a certain way. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
How are we doing for time, Chris?
We just hit 3:02.
I don't know what that means.
Maybe like we were like 36 minutes in or something like that.
Okay, just a thought on
Yeah.
what you were saying, Lillian, that I think is interesting is like you're talking about the way the work travels, right? Like literally in the case of Conceptions of White. Also, you were talking about community at York, and like what I think is really interesting about the architecture of York is that it's a commuter university. Like even like the ring where it almost feels like a bus depot, you know? Like, and I feel like that's another conception of the idea of community, one that is diffused. And I think we'll be talking about kind of the different articulations of community in one of the next panels. But yeah, I wonder, of course you have the Jane and Finch local community, but just as a quick follow-up, like how do you think about community in that more diffuse sense in terms of people coming from, all over Lower Ontario kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was definitely blown away by how many people came up on Wednesday for the opening. Like, I was saying to a friend of mine, like, I genuinely thanked everyone. I was like, thank you for coming. And it's tough. I think that's something that the AGYU dealt with for years and years, and it's gonna continue. It's sort of like, how do you get people to come? Because it is a commuter university, and I think a lot of the students don't really know about the art gallery. Like it's sort of an art gallery that doesn't have a profile on campus. It more has a profile like in the arts community, but we're sort of like dislodged from it, as you were saying, and sort of like you're not among your pals necessarily, but you're among your kind of like, I don't know, service audience. So it's something that we're always working on. I think the idea of the visible vault and also having like a standalone building, the idea that you can kind of like come up and hang out a bit more, like there's a bit more capacity for like I don't know, like in between time will hopefully help with that. I mean, and the subway station had that same kind of impact. But I think it's something also like to do kind of programming that doesn't necessarily require you to be like there. Like we just did a program with Anthony Douglas Cooper at the Leslie Spit. And so we were just sort of like went somewhere else and had people come out, and it was a really lovely program. So this kind of also not being sort of married to the building as the site for activity is something that, just by necessity we do.
Do you want to say anything? Or are we out of time?
I think we're probably close to out of time. But maybe I can just like riff off of that a little bit. Like I think that's an interesting aspect to think of like curatorially, like that there is like when it's more institutionally based and you're tied to like funding wise, maybe for instance tied to a building or tied to a space for a clientele or something like that. Like I mean, like, maybe Yasmin and Theresa, do you have thoughts, or can you riff off of this idea of like, where does the like space for curation happen? Is it just localized within the hub of the kind of like physical brick and mortar space of the institution or the building or the space you're curating? I mean, I think both of you kind of outlined in a way in which the space is also like dialogical, like between artist and curator, or artist and staff at the specific artist-run center or commercial space. So if you have any like kind of thoughts coming off of that.
I think it's really different on my end too, just because I'm running a business. And so that's like, people shop off of PDFs more than you think. So we need a space. We're only open 2 days a week, intentionally knowing that we're not the easiest to get to, so that people can make appointments, because we want, and we'll open for anyone. It's not just clients. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy, because like, as a gallery, your number one, a commercial gallery, your number one kind of concern is how do you keep your overhead down, so that, you know, when we get paid, our first, you know, we pay our artists, and then we pay our operating expenses, and that's really, you know, that's exactly where our priorities have to be, to just like stay open, because we're not eligible for any kind of funding or support, right? And so we really kind of rely on those people who will come during our open hours and purchase from us or tell their friends to come by. And, you know, we're really fortunate that that has been happening and that we can continue to do what we're doing. But I just think it's like a really different situation in terms of like, the consideration of community is of course there, but also like, we have to find a way to continue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for, you know, working within an institution that has like a, you know, a dedicated space, in the sense that that is how most people understand us to be, you know, positioned, it offers a very useful container to work in. And I think that the commissioning model allows us to think a bit more expansively beyond that. So what happens to an exhibition after it's presented at the gallery? How do you use publishing and public programs to not only provide new ways of engaging with the artist practices, but also maybe challenging the way in which a space is used? Oftentimes we'll, through our public programs, our participants will be proposing like a new way to use this space, maybe as a way of gathering, maybe as a way of yeah, being in relation to the artist's practice. And then oftentimes when we are working with international collaborators, then it brings Mercer into the sphere of elsewhere. And that's really exciting. I think that's an area we're interested in, like growing and developing more substantially, of thinking about what happens to our projects when they leave Mercer Union, and engage with other audiences. But you know, with the building itself, we've had ways of where we're trying to challenge like how this space is used. One really good example of that is our space commissioning program, which is on the eastern facade of our building, that's facing St. Clarence Street. And that was an initiative that started out in, I think, 2015 as like a billboard commissioning platform that's like largely for the presentation of image-based art and media-based art, but lens-based photography. But then over the last few years, the artists that we've been engaging with, like Lotus Lori Kang, Sakina Kaba, and now Ella Gonzalez, we're all really interested in bringing in different types of materials onto this flat surface and engaging with materiality, and thinking about what does visibility mean within a public space. So it's our most public-facing form of, you know, artistic engagement with our community. But I think that when you're working within a contemporary art context, you're always going to be thinking about the relationship between art and civic life. So I'm really open and to that possibility of what an institution like Mercer Union can do outside of the confines of its building too. I think that in tangible ways right now it looks like maybe lobbying or advocacy, but what does it look like in terms of artistic presentation? There's some really interesting examples of that on our website where we've done like public art before, and I think that's one on my wish list, of like something that we could do in the future outside of our neighborhood. But yeah, I think that hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. We're already behind schedule, but that's okay. Thank you, Lillian, Yasmin, Theresa. We're gonna have an actual 10-minute break. 10 minutes. The music is gonna stop after 10 minutes, and we're gonna get into the next panel. Okay, we're back. Tight 10. We forgot to mention in the introduction, but we did provide a little pamphlet for free that's in the entrance room. You'll notice that we're not orating people's bios in favor of just getting into the conversation. The pamphlet does include kind of a more extensive bio on the individuals participating, but also the organizations that they're a part of or have been a part of. So just wanted to point that out.
So the next panel, which is kind of centered around a thematic question, how do cultural practitioners build structures of support and belonging across geographies? We're going to invite up to the stage Hannah Doucet, all artists, just caveating since we also had all curators for the first panel. But again, many hats. Hannah Doucet, who ran Blinkers in Winnipeg. Patrick Cruz, who's part of many collectives, including the Plumb and founder of the Kamias Triennial, and Evan Furness, who is co-chair of This Town is Small in Charlottetown, PEI. So give a round of applause. So you're first up, Hannah. So as I mentioned, you ran the project space Blinkers. That was alongside Christina Bonera, Rachel Thorleifson, and John Patterson, and in part as a response to the lack of spaces supporting emerging artists in Winnipeg, and also as a way to build connections with other emerging artists across Canada. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about this impetus and maybe more generally how artist-run projects and community spaces feel continuous with how you conceive your practice as an artist.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think my favorite part of being an artist is like being in community with other artists. So it feels like that in that way, it's like just one and the same to organize a space that works with other artists and to be an artist. But yeah, Blinkers kind of came about because me and 3 of my friends in art school, we all went to do our undergrad at the University of Manitoba. And we kind of, as we were starting to exit school, we were in our final year, we were kind of like looking around, and there wasn't really any spaces in Winnipeg that would show our work at that point in our career. There's a really, really rich like artist-run culture in Winnipeg for the size of the city. There's so many amazing spaces, but they're, you know, the emerging category is so broad, like it's like 15 years that a lot of spaces are supporting more artists like later in their emerging moment than that moment. So we kind of were talking to one of our profs about that, and they and we were kind of being like, we just want to be like a band. Like bands just like have shows, like no matter what their like stage they're at in their career, and they like, you can be like a band that is brand new and you like travel and have just like DIY shows across the country or whatever. And we kind of wanted to like connect with other artists in kind of that spirit, I guess. So we ended up getting connected with some friends in through our prof, ended up getting connected with some friends in Vancouver who are all amazing artists like Gabby Dow and Scott Kemp, and there's like five different people. And we ended up organizing an exhibition for them. This is a long story, sorry. We ended up organizing a show for them in Winnipeg, and they organized a show for us in Vancouver at a space called Avenue that no longer exists. And that was really like an amazing moment for us, because in Winnipeg at that moment, there wasn't really any project spaces or like kind of newer emerging artist spaces. So we went to Vancouver and we saw like there was a really rich like project space, artist run like culture there at like earlier moments, not like 30, 40-year-old institutions. So we were really inspired by that. And then we came back to Winnipeg and we're like, we want to start something similar. So Blinkers came out of that. And so from its kind of beginning stage, it was really about connecting with artists outside of Winnipeg, because Winnipeg is a really small scene and it's geographically isolated. So we wanted to both support our local community, but also use it as a bridge to kind of like connect these early artists in their early stages of their career across the country, I guess. Yeah.
Maybe just a quick follow-up to that also. So Blinkers is no longer in operation technically under its name, and now you've kind of passed on the space over to your friend Luther Kanadu, who has rebranded it as the Center for Cultural and Artistic Practices, so CCAP. One thing like Parker and I were kind of interested in was the way this gesture maybe places value on change instead of keeping like a legacy alive. So like a legacy can kind of view like stability and permanence as kind of valuable in itself. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to this kind of openness to change and impermanence, and how that can be kind of valuable, like a valuable thing to do for kind of building collectivity.
Right from the beginning of Blinkers, we were like, almost just in order to feel the confidence to do it, we said like, there is no way for this to fail. If it exists for a couple years, that's great. We're like still doing something for our community, for ourselves, and that'll be like amazing. So we signed a 3-year lease. So I guess we were like, if it's 3 years and then it's done, that's a success. And we really kind of in a lot of ways formed Blinkers in a kind of frustration or reaction to artist-run centers that have existed for 30 to 40 years and are very institutionalized and are amazing in so many ways, and I'm so glad they exist, but also do not answer all of the needs of artists. So in that sense, if you exist forever, you will become what you are reacting against, kind of. So I think there is, like Parker also said in the intro, there's so much to be gained from not becoming formed into an institution that has rigid rules and ways of existing and a mandate that is like formed in one way. We wanted to be really responsive. We wanted to not program a year out. We wanted to, all these things. As you do that, you realize there's so many reasons why these artist-run centers work the way they do. And I was talking a bit to Gordon beforehand about how it's interesting thinking generationally, like we were very young when we started this, and I think there was like this reaction or anger to what's happened before, but you also, as you get even just a tad older, are like, oh, I could have actually talked to people that did this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and learned and maybe done it differently. But I guess with passing it over to Luther, I kind of got off track there, but we kind of were like, all moving on to other projects. I had moved to Toronto. 2 of my friends were moving to Europe. We were like, we're not going to be the people like driving this anymore. And if it just ceases to exist, that's cool. But we also knew how hard it was to get to the point we had gotten to in terms of finally being eligible for grants or having a bit of a reputation. Like artists knew about Blinkers and were more willing to work with us. Like there was all of that sort of stuff. So we were friends with Luther and really admired what a hard worker he was in terms of his art practice, in terms of public parking, on the online publication he ran. So we kind of approached him, and first it was just like he was going to curate one show, and then it kind of grew into this bigger thing where we were like, what if we just pass this off to you? From the get-go, we were really not precious. We were like, you can rename it. It can be like Public Parking Gallery. It can be whatever you want it to be. And he kind of at first just took it over as Blinkers for like a year or so, and then ended up doing the rebrand. And I think it's interesting on an individual level to go through that, because they're so, you do as much as you can say logically you want someone to change something. It's also like that founder syndrome thing is real. Like you feel it in your heart when someone's like, I don't want that name anymore. But I think it's amazing, and that's truly what we wanted him to do. We wanted him to take it, and he's made it better. And like, because I think of a lot of the work we did, he's been able to make it even better than what we were able to make. And I think that's the best case scenario, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about like the initial excitement, so much of the energy. There's a chaos to it, right? Like I feel like the longer something lasts, and maybe I'm also speaking as someone who organizes things and runs a space, but there's almost a desire to temper the chaos, and that leads to formalization and systems, but you kind of need the life and the chaos to propel the thing forward. So there's always like a negotiation, I think, between the chaos and the kind of formalized practices. And I think collectivity and collaboration is a good way to kind of maintain some of that chaos, which makes me think of you, Patrick. You have so many collaborative dimensions to your practice. Chris mentioned a few. There's also the Ben Flores Fan Club Collective, Boring Earth, and the Plumb. I'm just curious, maybe you could speak a bit about the way collaboration figures into your practice as an artist and an organizer.
Collaboration, I think, is one way of expanding your own understanding. For me, it's sort of, it's knowledge building, but it's also a kind of exchange, right? I think when you start a project, obviously it's easy to run it if it's just by yourself, right? But then that sort of limitation of your knowledge and your experience kind of ends there. So for me, collaboration really extends that language of possibilities. I didn't really intend to be in 4 collectives. That was not my plan. But I guess my natural temperament is to host, to gather. It's just something that comes natural to me. It's not, it's not like I love people kind of thing. I love people, but people are nice. But yeah, and I think the magic that comes with it is a bonus, right? And I mean the same way we're gathering right now. This is really important work, and it's also a lot of work, right? A lot of collaborative endeavors take so much dialogue and conversation and back and forth, and sometimes you will disagree on a certain aspect of the project, or sometimes it flows so easily. So I think there's just I like the sort of waves that you go through it. But yeah, I think I encourage everyone to collaborate with someone if they haven't.
Yeah, I also like your use of the word host or hosting. I mean, obviously, I think like in a way, like your practice as an artist, like sometimes also you use as like a platform for hosting others, and I think it's interesting to think of that as like, instead of maybe it just being like, I don't know, like individual outputs or outputs that tie to you, or here's like a concretization of like what's going on in my mind. You kind of, I don't know, there's almost like an ethics of like citing your relations, or like bringing that into conversation, which I think is really nice. I mean, and also like you're also just as a human a great host. Like you're,
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing cook. On that kind of note of thinking about kind of the networks of relations that are that one hosts or that bring people together. Evan, as we mentioned, so co-chair of This Town is Small, an artist-run center in Charlottetown, PI. When we were kind of meeting online and talking to you, one thing that really stuck out to us with regards to This Town is Small, your folks' operation, is that not all your members and staff are actually located in Charlottetown, but some of you live in more rural areas as well, which means your organization really acts like this like cultural connector across the province. Maybe you could speak a bit about how you folks build and sustain those relations across distance, both among staff and with artists. And because I know you mentioned also yourself, like you work a lot in rural areas, and like that's like at home for your practice as well. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So first I kind of want to give a little bit of context for what This Town is Small is and how they've operated kind of historically. This Town is Small is the only artist-run center on Prince Edward Island. And as an emerging artist, it's one of the only places, basically the only place other than Art in the Open, which is like a Nuit Blanche style festival where you can get paid like a proper Carfax fee on Prince Edward Island. And also, it started off as a spaceless organization. So we didn't have a gallery space. It was built kind of through collaborations with other organizations on the island. So some of those took the form of like, coffee shop exhibitions, partnerships with breweries for residencies and things like that. But also there's like tons of small community gallery spaces across the island that, operate as gallery spaces, but maybe in a more commercial sense, or, don't pay those Carfax fees. And what we were doing in the past was collaborating with those places, trying to professionalize them in a way that like artists could actually show their work in this kind of context on the island and not have to, go to somewhere else like Toronto or Halifax, and then we could actually share our work with people who live in the same province as us. And so, yeah, those kind of collaborations were great. And we also like started this project called Radiant Rural Halls, which Laura Demers, who's a curator based in Toronto, did a project with us. And one of the pamphlets for that is out there. But yeah, that Radiant Rural Halls is a kind of a unique project where we kind of install artworks or performances in community halls across the island. And for those of you who don't know what that is, basically they're these small buildings that kind of operate as like theater spaces, but also like community spaces where like there's cooking workshops and there's like community groups who meet and like, do quilting and things like that. Like they're very multi-purpose spaces, and there's so many of them across the island. And so our idea was, because so many people live rurally, and it's actually the majority of people, like I think maybe one board member lives in town, and all the staff live outside of Charlottetown. So our idea was to kind of like present work in these like pockets across the island in the hopes of like showing people to show work in their own communities, while also activating these spaces that are like so important historically to the island, but are also just kind of like up for use and are kind of like unique, amazing spaces. And so that was kind of like our attempt to try and like connect with everybody. So, and it was great, and it is great, but something that has been missing for Islanders is kind of like a white cube gallery space, which I know like a lot of people are trying to get away from, but we're kind of trying to get a little bit to it. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so like with This Town is Small, we did this kind of space project where we consulted across the island. We hired a consultant, Penny McCann from Ottawa, and she came and kind of did interviews with focus groups. We had like open surveys, and the consensus that we heard was that kind of people really needed a space that they could come together as like an anchor point for a community. Because something that's challenging when you're doing all of these like satellite projects is there's no actual place that you can go to like see or meet the people who are doing this kind of work. A lot of the time we were doing, work from home, or we have an office space in Charlottetown, but it's like, it was up like a flight of stairs that is super inaccessible, and also just like not open to the public because it's like private artist studios and things like that. And so basically that has led us to what we now just have is the Hilda Woolnough Gallery, which is in the basement of the Guild. We've actually taken that space over and have Elise in there, and now are like presenting professional exhibitions, while also now being a place where you can just kind of drop in and like talk to our staff and like, hang out, look at work. We have a collection of like books and things that people can spend time reading. Yeah, so long story short, that is how we do the challenging work of connecting an entire island.
Thanks, that's so interesting to think about. I think one of the things that we discussed as a group leading up to this discussion was the kind of different vectors or perspectives on the idea of a network. And Evan, I think you're speaking a lot to that in your last comments. I also think it's interesting to think about, how does a network play out in different geographic contexts? An archipelago is a network of its own. the rural context provides different considerations or advantages on network. Of course, the urban, like city-based network has connotations of like exchanging business cards and networking or something like that. But yeah, I guess maybe just for the three of you, I'm curious how networks kind of inform the way you work, how you think about being in relation with peers, collaborators, collective members, etc.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So networks, I guess, like I think being an artist can often be a very solo endeavor. So I definitely like think collaboration and collectivity is like essential to continue in that in this work. But I guess like in Winnipeg, I've been only based in Toronto for the past 5 years, and before that I was always in Winnipeg, and it can feel like somewhat isolating from perceived everything else going on when you're there, because it's like geographically isolated and then also not one of the major cities in Canada that people are looking to for art. So yeah, I think Blinkers was kind of a means to try to like both support other artists but also support ourselves in that venture of like making connections and creating a network through that felt like not networking like in the business card sense, but networking in the way that like literally I just want to have friends that are interested in the same things as me, and there's actually a pretty small scene of people in Winnipeg that are interested in those things. So I think that I don't know if that answers the whole question.
Yeah, networks on PEI are like pretty interesting. Despite being really small, there's actually like a lot of like, people do work in isolation. Like it's not like the big, huge community that you would imagine that it would be, I think there's like different ways of being artists, and one of the problems with being in such a small place is that you're like all kind of vying for the same resources, and you're all kind of trying to work together, but also like, trying to make your own work in your own way. And because of us being such a small province, there's not a ton of resources for artists. Even we have like one good art supply store that just opened 2 years ago. Otherwise it's Michael's and ordering from above ground. So I'm stocking up while I'm here. So like a lot of the networks take the form of like friends being like, okay, I need to like make a big painting. Who has a barn I can work in? Or like, I need to build something out of wood for this show. Who has a table saw that I can go and use? Or even things like, but one of the cool things about PEI though is that like, because, I mean, it's a small place, but there's so much variety in what people are doing. And people are quite skilled at it too. So like, if you're into like experimental sound stuff, there's like a community of it out there, and you can kind of like tap into that. Or like I also run the Charlottetown Zine Fest, which started in 2022. And so we're trying to build a network of like people who are working in zines and like self-publishing, and by doing things like offering like publication grants for people to like create their own books and things like that. And so a lot of like the networking comes from like, kind of exchanges like that, or, trying to build your own networks through like getting grants to then support other people. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
I mean, I think luckily Toronto is a very friendly city compared to Vancouver. Not to shit on Vancouver. Vancouver is actually beautiful. It's a beautiful city. I lived there for a long time, so I understand the art ecology there fairly well. But what was shocking was when I moved to Toronto, it was like going to openings. I feel like there was no mediation, like there was no like sort of, it didn't feel like I was impeding on someone's clique. Whereas, in Vancouver, it felt like I need to work my way to befriend them. Maybe that's sort of a scale of a community. I'm not sure if that's the same in PEI, but I think there's a kind of a protectiveness sometimes. Another network that I'm quite active to is in Manila, which is where I grew up. So sometimes I do compare these sort of different ecologies of networks and the way they operate, and obviously everyone has their own style of putting together an exhibition or creating, dialogue. But at the end of the day, it's all the same, really. Like, everyone just wants to make something beyond the normal matrix of life.
I'm going to go off the question path for a second here, because there's one thing that I think is kind of interesting to think about. Hannah, you were mentioning before in your like kind of outlining of Blinkers, like this kind of like youthful punk ethos of like reject the antecedents or whatever, and just kind of like you feel like there's a lack of need of like kind of or maybe like creating the space was also like a lack of feeling like you belonged in maybe also precedents that were there. And it's just interesting to maybe think through, like, again, that question of like as you kind of move on, maybe there's this impulse to want to also like tie to historical or like over time changes. Like artist Louis Jacob often mentions this thing about Toronto, that it's kind of in a constant state of like burying it's past in a way, and like there's a forgetfulness, and you see that also in like projects in art, like certain things come up again historically about Toronto. And so maybe there's also a question of like how do you see kind of like belonging shifting over time? Like initially it can be like a kind of maybe a response also of like you find the community where you're at, but then understanding like how the geography is, or like understanding kind of like the history of the place you're working in. I could see it also like deepening and changing and going over time, and I was wondering if the three of you had any kind of thoughts in terms of kind of like that development, like how that changes.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Like, I finished my undergrad a decade ago, and that's not that long ago, but also it's a decade. And I feel like how quickly you shift from that, like, person that is, that really youthful energy that's like, there's no spaces for me, to then being like the person exactly that you were kind of like looking at in terms of, I guess, the framework of like, I'm like on the cusp of like, do I call myself an emerging artist anymore? Maybe not. Whereas before I was, I don't know. I think that frame just changes really fast. And I think to talk about, I think that you kind of have to have a bit this like, I think a little bit of level of ignorance, or like maybe ignorance is a bad word, but naivety or something, to do a space, because it is actually like so much work and so hard. And if you looked into like the entire history of like which spaces have existed and when they left and how they left and why it was so hard, you probably wouldn't do it. So I think, or I don't know if I would have. So I think it's good that you're just like a bit naive and you just jump in. But I think now I'm definitely at the point where I like am interested in, because really I feel like probably when we started Blinkers, there was almost like, why are there no project spaces in Winnipeg? But it's like, obviously there have been, there just wasn't in that moment. We were coming up. And so like, I think there's interesting work. Like, I think Black Flash a while back did like a whole thing about like looking at like collectives and history in the history of collectives and arts organizing in the prairies. And I think like that's like even this panel is doing, like looking at things, even if they don't continue to exist, that history is so important and interesting to learn from and to look at. And I don't necessarily think I've like done all of that work in terms of learning from that, but I feel like I'm more in that moment of being like, you could still reject things and think things are bad, but also like actually looking at the history is probably useful.
Sorry, it was a question of belonging. And
Yeah, I guess it's, no, No. I think it's good. I mean, I think you're right. Like, or I think that's a nice observation. The question is kind of like how, I guess in some sense, like how do you like grow that connection of belonging? Because it's easy to maybe like build a certain set of relations, but obviously like situations change, context change, like space, like Hannah was saying, like there's a kind of like naivete maybe like going into it, thinking that like you can do it and like change it. And I think it's good to keep a level of that aspirational hope, but then I think as you go on, you realize that like, okay, there's a whole history of folks who've been doing this before, and like how maybe like just reflecting on like how has kind of like your sense of belonging maybe like taken that into account or deepened just as like, I don't know.
I guess we're also sort of in an advantage, right? Because we're affiliated with artists, with curators. We some of you may have gone to art school, and so I think belonging is sort of easier to access that. But I think if you're an outsider, maybe you've done your education outside and you've moved to a city, and maybe you didn't study art, or I think it's a different way of navigating that space. I don't know how it happens. I think it's magic. I don't know. But I think the kind of openness, I guess, is necessary. Right, you need to be open. I feel like it's easy to blame the community, or it's easy to blame the city, or the people are unfriendly or whatever. But it's still kind of up to you. I think as much as it is a community work, it's also like you need to kind of work it out and find a way to find that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think belonging is like a super important thing, obviously. And in a small place, like when you are the only organization that's kind of speaking for all professional visual artists, it can be challenging to kind of like accommodate everybody in that way. But I think that's something this town is small really tries to do super well in that kind of realm, is meeting people kind of where they're at in their practice. So like, I don't know, there's a lot of people on the island who, are very established artists and like, do show work a lot. And when we work with them, we treat them as such, we treat them as professional artists. But then there's a lot of people who are like very new to exhibiting work and like maybe don't even have like a proper CV, or, don't even know where to begin about like writing exhibition proposals. Or maybe do know where to begin, but like want some help. And so like, something I think this town is small does really well is we kind of like take those like more emerging artists under our wing a bit with this project called the Peak Street Collective, which initially started as like house exhibitions 20 years ago in one of our board members' living rooms, where basically like it was there's like no hierarchy to showing work with Peak Street. It's like if you submit something, we will present it. And so you get people who are like professional artists exhibiting with like people who have never shown work before, which is like a really cool context. But something that Peak Street does outside of just like the exhibitions is we kind of like, we will actually like mentor people. So Donnelly Down, who is kind of the founder of Peak Street, she meets with people and, talks through their work with them, like tries to like find ways of fitting, what they're trying to say into the context of an exhibition kind of proposal, and really like takes them from like the beginning to the presentation of their work. And I think that's like kind of a unique thing that this town is small does, and I also think it's like super important for where we are in the country. Like there's no art school on the island. There's a 1-year like foundations program in visual arts. There's no university art gallery. So there's like not a lot of education opportunities for people who want to get into this kind of realm of showing in gallery contexts. And so I think this town of small does like a great job of meeting people where they're at in their practice in that way. But also I think just being open to like people's feedback and things, which I think is super important when you are the only space.
So one more thing, sorry. This doesn't work. Because I didn't talk about belonging at all, I just was thinking that feel like we obviously made Blinkers in this way to like create a space that we felt we belonged, and like our friends and like the community of emerging artists. But then one thing that I thought was really interesting when I'm like reflecting back, because I'm no longer doing that project, is that when you create a space, you create power for yourself, which you don't anticipate, like, and then you suddenly have this like cultural capital and power within the scene, even though you are like, we're non-hierarchical, we're, you know, whatever, like, we don't have roles. It's like, you actually, and it kind of made me think of Yasmin, what you said too, it's like, it's a surprise when you're like in that position, suddenly you're like, oh, we have power. And I think that was an interesting thing to navigate and negotiate, because it kind of feels like you're trying to just make a space where like, that's a community space for you too, but then suddenly you're like almost outside of the community in a way because of you made it. And that was like a very funny thing to try to reflect on and think about, like, maybe are there ways to like deactivate that structure? And like, we tried different things, but obviously it's like, you are still at the end of the day, the gatekeepers for the space that you made and just like pay for out of pocket. And it's kind of a funny dynamic. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think about that a lot too. It's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of like destroying yourself somehow. Yeah, I think the question of belonging is question of belonging is an interesting one. I think coming out of our first event, Reza Nick, who was on the panel, kind of described this distinction between inclusion and belonging, and how inclusion can often be kind of like a strategy or a policy for a larger kind of corporate endeavor, whereas belonging is almost like an ethics of being. And I think I really appreciate the articulations of that you three gave us. Speaking of the kind of professional nature of working in the arts, I think what's interesting about all 9 panelists in today's event, but also you three, is that you all work as practicing artists, but also administrators. You know, you work in curatorial capacities. I'm curious if that's how you think about those kind of divisions of your own labor or your own practice or ways of thinking. Yeah, maybe who wants to start there?
I guess I started teaching at a university full-time in the past. This will be my 3rd year. It really takes over your life. So I think it's the juggling of hats has changed, but I also feel like, you know, I'm not in my 20s anymore, so it's not punk rock. And I gotta pay my student loan. So I think priorities also shift as a cultural worker, right? You start to really, I do miss the artist time, you know, the artist schedule where you daydream all day and imagine what you wanna make. It's a nice idea, but yeah, I think it's sort of, and then, you know, there's so many factors, right? Living in an expensive city, expensive studio, expensive materials, and you're trying to upkeep this career, this practice, this art practice. At the same time, there's so much admin involved. You know, people think you just go to the studio, but there's so much paperwork actually that goes through the production of something. So I don't know, I think this juggling and management of time, I keep asking my coworkers, what's your strategy? How do you keep yourself sane, or how do you balance? And none of them have answers. You're like, you're on your own. I'm like, okay. But I think the beauty of being a cultural worker or being an artist is that there's a flexibility to what occupation you can take, besides the subject matter that you can engage with. I like the liberty that it gives you. And, you know, having the capacity to curate or to organize exhibitions, it also gives you that capacity to give voice to other artists that may have not been, you know, who didn't have the same amount of exposure or opportunity. So I think it's just spreading that energy in different channels trying to be more rhizomatic. But I think the challenge is like, how do you sustain that energy and not burn out, right? Because it's so easy to dream big and really put yourself out there, but if you burn out, then you burn out, then that's it, right? So take your vitamins.
Yeah, that last point, that's so real. That's so fucking real. Yeah, I mean, like, so the hats that I wear, I'm a visual artist, but then I'm the co-chair of This Town is Small. My day job is as a producer for a theater arts organization. And then I also run Charlottetown Zine Fest. Sometimes all of these things overlap at the exact same time. And it can be a lot, but at the same time, like, for me, I also work in film sometimes as like a art director. But it's like, yeah, on the island, you can't really just like do one thing. Like, in order to like sustain yourself, you really need to like kind of like diversify what you do. But also, I think like for me, all these different like aspects of my professional practice, they all kind of like come together in a way that I hope like makes me both a better artist and a better administrator. Because experiences, for example, like this of me coming to a different city in a different province and like speaking, and the great hospitality that you both have shown in the lead up, like I'm gonna take those nuggets with me into the next time that I invite somebody to my province and my city. Or I work with someone who's like a super skilled carpenter, and I like learn like little bits and tricks that they've been using for years that I just like had no idea about. And so for me, like these, while it can be like super exhausting and super like difficult to wear all these hats and do all these things, like I think for me they all serve each other in a way that I hope like just strengthens my ability to like support other people, but also like support myself in my own practice.
I for the past long time have worked in community arts as kind of more my regularly paid work. So I used to do lots of arts facilitation and still sometimes do, but now I work as like a community programs manager at a community arts organization in Toronto. And I will say, like, noticing the differences between Winnipeg and Toronto, obviously a big one is like the cost of living in Toronto is so wild. So like Winnipeg, at a certain point when I was running Blinkers and I had a studio and I obviously had an apartment I lived in, I like was spending I think $800 for all 3 of those spaces. Obviously I lived with 2 people, I shared a studio with someone, and I co-ran Blinkers with 3 people, but still like that's insane. So I think it's like in that sense, that's wearing all those hats is a lot more manageable in some ways in a city like Winnipeg, because you don't have to spread yourself as thin financially to do things that are unpaid. But I also found like near the end of Blinkers, I really wasn't making art as much anymore. It fed me in a lot of ways, but I wasn't like my own personal artistic practice definitely was like on the back burner. So I think it's a push and pull. I think there's moments for both, and I don't think I always need to be focused on my individual art practice, but I think after I stopped Blinkers, it was really nice to kind of like have space to refocus on that, at least for a while. And then, now I guess for the past 2 years, I've had this role at a community arts organization that's full-time. We're on a 4-day work week, so that's really nice. But it's definitely just super hard to maintain an active art practice and have a full-time job. And I think the next panel is going to talk about that, so I'm excited. But I feel like I always it's the most boring but also most interesting conversation to talk to other artists of being like, how do you do this? Because I truly don't know what the right answer is, and I don't know, there probably isn't one. But it's tough.
It's definitely a tricky thing, and I think there's like a multiplicity of ways, but also like some options just suck, and like you're kind of stuck with it, and you just can't get the time to do the practice you want to do. I guess like in the ideal situation, you're doing what you want to do across a range of things, and like you're okay with like being an artist not 100% of the time, which I feel like is a huge pressure.
My solution right now is just staying up till like midnight every single night in my studio, and it's not sustainable.
Just like, max your time awake. On that note, we've maxed our time for this panel, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. Thanks.
This is the real ones who are left. We're way over time, but really appreciate you all staying. We're just going to get right into this. So we're excited to welcome Felix Rapp, co-editor and designer of Le Chauffage, Elise Boudreau Graham, co-director of Céline Bureau, and Ben de Boer, one quarter of Hearth here in Toronto. So the kind of thematic question that we'll be framing this discussion is, how do cultural practitioners benefit from professionalization while maintaining collective principles? So Felix, let's start with you. It's so great that we're able to combine today's event with the launch of the third issue of Le Chauffage, whose the theme of that issue is day jobs, like I said earlier. And I think, there's one vantage on professionalization, which is artists having to be almost their own brand or their own agent as a marketing tool for in a lot of ways. And I think there are drawbacks to that and benefits, but the theme of your issue has a perspective, what happens when artists just have another job? How does taking out the economic considerations of one's practice change the output or enable a different practice entirely? Maybe you could just talk a bit about the genesis of this issue and, your views on professionalization.
Yeah, God, it's always weird hearing yourself on a mic. The premise of Le Chauffage, the idea of it was, Le Chauffage is a French word that means the heater. The principle was something to gather around, so that you would have something that was like very community oriented. And I think that when we both, the two other people that I do this program with, now both of us came out of school, and we're feeling that we were looking also, like what Hannah was talking about, looking for avenues to kind of like interact with people. I think we both love art, and that's the foundation for it. And subsequently, having a name for something that was outside of yourself was this like amazing excuse where we could like write artists we loved. Like in the first issue, when we had no money and no real structure, no website, no anything, we were able to, write to someone like Talia Shetrit, for example, to ask to republish an image, just because we said, oh, we represent this Le Chauffage thing. And I think that was, we realized that was a really fantastic tool for us to have this license to do all this kind of stuff. So the premise for this issue in particular was, about the day job. I think it comes from the fact that my best friend and I, he lives in Brussels, and I live in Vancouver, which apparently, according to today, is a heavy weight. I'm sorry to all of you. And we talk on the phone every day because it's just how friendships can be sometimes, and that means often when I'm commuting to work or I'm commuting home from work, if he's still awake. And a lot of it comes back to kind of complaining about your job, frankly, or complaining about not having enough time, or trying to like hash out the complex interpersonal dynamics of your colleagues and your bosses and your whatever. And so it was really kind of about finding a way to think about like how this thing that's like consuming us and is very is really not a dignified way of being, like working under people that work under other people. How can that come to fold back into like what we do as artists? Or like how can we make that a productive activity also for our art making at the same time, as opposed to like trying to be like, oh, this is what I do in my like after work time, and this is what I do while I'm working, And so there's concepts that come about, like la perruque, the wig, which is this, I'm going to mispronounce this, Sartre is this like this theoretician who posed this premise, this idea that like you could, while you were working your job, you could kind of steal back your time or your agency by like using the things that are available to you at your job to, produce an ashtray or, a bonnet or whatever. And I think that kind of comes back in like, Emile worked as a registrar for a blue chip gallery in Brussels for like 5 years, and now he is a faculty member at a school in Brussels, and I have been running a freelance photo retouching business for years, but it really just means that like my clients are my bosses, and I have like 20 bosses, and they all harass me at all hours. And now I'm the photo and exhibitions technician at the University of British Columbia. So that means I just like help students to produce their work and learn about photography and like the real palpable skills of that. In all of those instances, we've always tried to find ways to, like, yeah, we used to use the FedEx account from the, I mean, this might be outing ourselves, but we used to use the FedEx account from the gallery to, like, ship all of our magazines to everybody, and, like, whether or not that was paid back is, like, you know, or, like, you know, using the printers at work, or, like, using the contact list at work to, like, find certain avenues to, like, reach out to people. So trying to kind of, like, steal back a little bit of the perceived daily minute injustice of like being employed was definitely part of that. And also, yeah, kind of a way to stretch our pay, I guess, too, you know. Art and cultural workers are like pretty underpaid, considering some of the other sectors. And yeah, so there's a lot of questions that came up for us, and like we were just kind of wondering, like, how are other artists dealing with this? Because you all have jobs, I assume. It's like there's no way that you can survive and do artwork or like make artwork or like participate or like run spaces or whatever without having something else as a side hustle. And like, yeah, the question of like freedom, is there freedom to be found in decoupling money from art? Like decoupling, like, you know, for example, there's certain kinds of artworks that are made for commercial purposes, right? If you have a show at a commercial gallery, you make a certain kind of work. Ideally, it's iterative. Ideally, it's comprehensible. Ideally, it sells. And on the other side of that, there's a certain kind of artwork that's made that comes from public funding, because if you write grant applications, right, you're foreseeing how certain kinds of works might be realized. Now, contingent again on if it's a project grant or a concept of realization or a whatever grant. But like, what's outside of those things, right? And like, what happens if like you just, I don't know. Is there a way to make art with no money? I mean, probably not. But there are, of course, it's such a broad spectrum. And so we were kind of curious to see kind of what that all looks like. And so like what I observed out of like making this thing that took us almost 3 years to make is basically that it's extremely convoluted, that there is not a single pathway, evidently, and that like inheriting that paradox is part of the whole thing. Like there's this great contribution by this artist in LA, named Reagan Moss, who works full-time as a lawyer, on top of like having a full-time art practice. And her contribution was just to basically make this like pros and cons chart of like, the title says, chart pros and cons of working a second job while working as an artist. So like pros, provides a secondary source of income. Cons, means you may have to take a low-paid or significantly lower-paid position in order to have the flexibility of part-time work. Pro, serves as an alternative source of self-esteem. Cons, involves reporting to formal authority figures and their evaluations. Pros, reduces futile wishing for trust funds. Cons, creates constant ongoing stress to maintain employment. So like this kind of thing, I think, is like somehow my life is just like wedged between these two realities of that kind of pragmatism. And I think that clarity about this, like, I am an artist and I make a living off of like my artwork, is like a total myth for our generation, probably. I mean, I don't know if it was necessarily ever entirely true. But like, I just think that artists are kind of like mascots of like this hustle culture, and like Vancouver especially, which is like the bastion of neoliberalism, where like property rights have always been more important than like human rights. If you've ever been to the Downtown East Side, you'll see that. I think it's especially true there. And sometimes it is just about paying the bills and like doing your own thing. It's like not necessarily related, but also that like maybe that activity of working could bleed into becoming subject matter or form, which I think is also really beautiful and like really relatable for people who like are not into art discourse or like art theory or like didn't go to art school. Like everybody has a job. If you make work about having a job, people are probably like, I relate to this, you know? And I think that that's like, it sounds really stupid to say, but like art school is also extremely convoluted, and like I think of the value system and the taste making that occurs at art school, as somebody who works in art school now, is like there's all of these like rules and regulations about what kind of work you can make, or what is like work of good taste, or like what is good, frankly, that I think sometimes is like really not related to like real life. So anyway, maybe I'll cut it off there. One thing I want to also say is like this thing about like my parents' generation, about like identifying with your job, I think is also pretty interesting. Like for me, and I'm so curious to hear like how other people feel about this, but like for me, I identify as an artist first, and like then all of these other things are these kind of like, it's all this umbrella underneath that kind of gets enveloped by it. And so for me, then I think like, yeah, artistic activity and how it relates to all of that, it's all like material or something for me. Anyway, sorry, yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I was thinking also of this, like, I think it's probably not very prevalent as much anymore, but this idea you gotta like love your job, like this professional idea. But I do really like the idea of like, you can hate your job and it's just your job, but maybe there's ways that like you don't overcome the exploitation, but through theft or through finding ways of using resources that should be yours that are not yours, you can find an equivalence that works for you in some way. And that in some ways, like maybe there's certain jobs that then become beneficial, or you just learn you're learning, maybe it's a resilience strategy more than something else, but I like that there's I don't know, there's other ways of conceiving it, because I do think there's this idealization of certain types of jobs, especially for artists to have. So that maybe is like a good place to turn to Ben, because I think there's some sort of question of like translation there between contexts. And in addition to being part of Hearth, you're also a member of the Toronto Experimental Translation Collective, TETSI. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about like notions of translation and how they're kind of core to the like various activities you do in your collectives, but also maybe thinking through a bit of like a way that translation can also maybe be a mode of like code switching or switching between different contexts.
Yeah, I think that the process of translation, it helps me, and of course like me here, I'm kind of on behalf of 8 other people. So it's already a little bit of a story of a partial observer. So what I'm going to say is obviously influenced by everybody else, but it is also just a little bit of my own personal consideration on this. But when you translate something, you loosen your attachments to the relationship that you had with the original thing. And it places you in this weird kind of like distance away from it, where you're calling into question why you thought a certain way about it. So like why you made these certain choices, what led to these choices, and instead of seeing the source text and the target text, or the source context and the target context as these kind of stable positions, it reveals that these positions are these weird zones. It's almost like anything like a text, you could flip it over like a tapestry or something, and you see all the different threads in the back end, and it's like completely different than what the surface that you're interacting with looks like. And I feel like with working with translation across media, like with TETSI, and with even just the idea of being a collectivity in the first place and relating, it's a spatial practice where we're like, what does it mean to like even come together and spend time together and reflect on what is this, like what is we, who is we, like all this like all these considerations, and of course all these considerations that influence the type of desires that we individually possess. This all comes from completely different experiences of the world. And so when TETSI gets together, our evolution is experienced like by becoming really like involuted and hermetic and closed off, and we kind of gestate for a while and then explode. And then with Hearth, it was a way of us meeting and spending time together and getting to learn like what it is that we cared about in the first place. And then the gallery space is a kind of container that we can invite other people in to share in that experience of reflection. and as Patrick said, it's being a host, right? You know, and in order to do that, you need to move at a really like careful pace, and it allowed us to kind of maybe understand what aspects of the galleries that we had been in prior and the institutions that we had inhabited prior or spent time with and made working relationships prior, like what attributes of that did we like and what we didn't like, and instead of like immediately deciding like this is what we're going to do, this is a mandate, here are the policies that come from that mandate, it was more like how can we have a mandate that keeps us almost open to constantly changing and keep us open and questioning, and in having that kind of guiding principle, we're not really, we haven't really decided what we are yet, and that's kind of nice because it means that the gallery, well, I mean, ideally maybe, it exists as this kind of container for differentiation, and when that's possible, it's so much of, like, it hardly has to do with our taste, and I think that that's kind of a beautiful thing, like, our own tastes, they do come into play, but also we just always want to be receptive to what other people are saying and learn about what's out there. So like doing open calls and always having kind of like an open line, like we're always able to answer questions. And maybe in the same way that the chauffage is a space for warming, a hearth is too, which is really, I was like, wait, I was like, what? Oh my God. And I think that like the hearth, you know, it warms us up and it also like makes us a little parched, and like it just, it increases our thirst for like capitalism's annihilation. And even though it embodies a kind of, you know, it looks like a gallery because it is, but it's like, it's also kind of a space where we can hospice those little tiny states inside of our brain that we like still hold on to, for better or worse, usually for worse, and like give them the due process of like a dignified death so we can like unload these kind of knee-jerk reactions that we've been having inside of capitalism for so long, so that we can like, you know, go and maybe it'll change, you know? And it hasn't always been a gallery. Before, you know, when we first began, the question that we had so often was like, is this a yoga studio? Or like, is this the showroom for the condo that they're building immediately next to you? Or you just generally like, what is this? And I missed that. I really missed that because it made us constantly think like, yeah, true, like no, this is a gallery. And they're like, what do you show? And it's like, well, that thing there, or this painting. And they're like, that's art? It's like, yeah, it's like, but it's in a garage. So it really made us realize like how important context is. And then for a while we didn't have a physical space at all. So then the question shifted to like, what are you doing here? Like, oh, like not in like a neat, mean way, but like, oh, like I didn't, like, you have a show here, or like you're doing this kind of programming in this place, or like, oh, I didn't expect to see you here, or like, that's cool that you're here. So it was like, this, again, a spatial kind of thing, like triangulating us. And then now we don't really get walk-ins anymore, which is really sad, because that was my favorite part of having a gallery that like opened onto the street. I was talking with Rowan a couple days ago, and we were like, oh, like we were really scared to put our A-frame sign out on St. Clair, because we were like, who's that going to bring in? Like, what's it going to be like? And we both lived on St. Clair for a lot of time, so like, it doesn't bring in anybody. Now, like, the only people that are coming in are like kind of part of a designated community in a sense. So like, it's like people we either already know or know somebody already, so they have like this different connection to it. Yeah, I mean, that kind of strays away from translation, but it is also like, Hearth has kind of gone through these like multi-step translations. And yeah, I think that taking that approach like keeps us open to changing again. Yeah.
It's nice that hosting keeps coming up, because I think for Céline Bureau, hosting is so much of kind of not only the foundations, but also what it is a residency program does. And Elise, you told us about how the kind of origins of Céline Bureau was really one of the founders, Hugo Dufour, opening up his home. So on the face, you have what appears to be this kind of at least national, maybe international residency program, when in practice it is someone opening up their home, their domestic space, and really like being generous in such a personal domain. And of course, that influences people's desire to participate, because the intimacy is, I would assume, so much more palpable. So I'm curious, like as the organization grows, you know, I know you guys are pursuing funding now and grants and trying to make those connections between the personal and the professional. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about, yeah, the kind of inception and that domestic space, but also how you keep in touch with it as you grow.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually became the co-director of Céline Bureau 4 years ago when one of the founders left, and I actually met Hugo, my other co-director, because I was a resident at Céline Bureau. So it was a very nice introduction to the space. So we're still in Hugo's house. We're also in a garage space, in the garage below where he lives. And we no longer host the artists in the apartment space. That kind of stopped around COVID. And we shifted to a bit more of a direction of working with local artists or artists who are just moved to town or will be in Montreal for the summer. So we run our studio residency during the spring and summer months, and then we have a writing residency for artists who want to produce written work that happens in the fall. And it's myself and Hugo, and we have a residency coordinator until the end of the year. And each time we have a new cohort in of residents, I try to make it very clear that none of us are working full-time on this project. All of us have other jobs, and really kind of set our own boundaries and also the expectation of the space. Like, we are not available full-time, you know, we have other things going on, and I think that's just a way to kind of protect ourselves and not burn out. And yeah, I think like being clear about that is really important, because you have maybe like a presence online or people know about you, and you kind of have this certain reputation that people might assume certain things, and you're like, actually, you know, we're just scrambling to make it work. Like, we actually have to shut for the winter months because we ran out of funding. So, you know, that's like the day-to-day reality. And like another conversation that we have a lot is about intentional growth and sustainable growth. So over the past couple of years, I feel like people have, like in Montreal, have heard about our space and really want to collaborate with us. And at first it was so exciting to say yes to everything, and like, you know, we're building our network, like we want to be involved with all these people, and then realizing that that is also just a path to burnout. And being able to say no to something really also helps us articulate what our vision of a space is, and really choosing what we want to be a part of. Like for the past 2 years, we've had people come up to us and ask us if we want to be part of, like, why don't we have a booth at For Plural, you know? And we're like, maybe we should. Like, that's a really seductive idea. Like, I would like to meet all these people, you know? But then I actually looked at the price of a booth, and it's like, I would rather be giving that money directly to artists, you know? And like being like, that is not actually our path for growth. Yeah, and just grounding ourselves in what our mission is. Yeah, so also, like, I know we're in Toronto, and Montreal is maybe seen as this like ideal real estate situation, but like, to be real, we would not exist to this day if we were paying rent. Like, and that allows us to take more risk, be able to take on more projects when we don't have to worry about paying rent. But that also means we're in a garage. Like, we don't do programming during the winter because it's freezing like that. So we kind of like percolate during the winter. And oh yeah, one more thing, like so we're a non-for-profit, we have a board, but our board is all artists and art workers, and like they really support what we do. I'm not worried about having a pushback from our board. We're all on the same page, and like that's another way, like they help us articulate, you know, our vision as well.
one thing when we met and we chatted about that you talked about, Elise, about Céline Bureau, is that you folks do like a kind of like outreach program also for folks who may not have the same kind of like formalized educational training in the arts, and which I think is really interesting to think about, because I mean, this panel's about professionalization in some way, and we've kind of talked about this in different ways in the other panels also. Like the university looms large as like a way to be or to become an artist, and it's also like a major force in shaping how the city changes and develops. And like, I mean, a place like Montreal, like people come in, like some American students come in every year and then head out, and that also changes like the rent prices as like leases go over and stuff like that. So it's interesting to think about that, and like to think also that there are folks who just don't have access to these opportunities. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then also just opening it up to Felix and Ben, both of you as well. Just want to note what you said, Ben, about like Hearth being this like open line through artist calls and stuff like that.
Yeah, so our residency will usually choose 6 artists for the cohort, and we try to choose like diversity of practices, and because we are in a garage space, we say that, you know, our space is not actually the highlight of what we're offering the artists. So we've based our residency around a series of critiques. So the artists have to agree to come to these 4 dates, and we invite in artists or curators to kind of be guests for the critique. And yeah, so we do say in our call out, like we invite anyone with you know, a current practice, and that we are open to artists who maybe don't have professional training or have taken a large hiatus from their practice and are coming back. And so that's something we've always said since the beginning. And then I actually, when we went through our process of looking at applications this past year, I noticed that in the applications we had people who were not formally trained. They were like almost got the residency, and then, you know, they weren't chosen. And I was like, okay, we're not actually choosing artists who are not professionally trained. Like, we're not actually putting in practice what we say we want. And why is that? And like you know, most of the people that we work with, like who are on our board, or myself and Hugo, we have arts school training, and realize like we are judging their applications and the language in their applications based on this group of people who went to art school. And so is that, you know, really fair to like what our expectations are? So I think something that we want to do going forward is offer like a workshop on how to do your application before the applications are actually due. And yeah, trying to think of ways of like, yes, we were saying we want this, but how are we doing this in practice? And also with our critiques, like this year was the first year that maybe some of the artists weren't comfortable with the critique format and didn't have experience with it, and then ended up just having like a bad experience after our first critique. And how do we address that? Like, through education, like having, before we have our first critique next year, I think we'll do like a Crit 101, what to expect. So, you know, like trying to have everyone at least start on a similar page so that we can put into practice what we're actually saying that we want.
Yeah, with Hearth, I guess all of our programming is like fairly inconsistent. It's gone all over the place. Like, we've offered residencies in the past. We've had a kind of an incubator for different curators. We've had guest curators come in, and it's all been kind of developed in response to our own capacities as well. Like and we've been very transparent with everybody that we work with, like what we're capable of providing. And I guess looking back, it's kind of come from the DIY ethos of like skill sharing as well, and different types of resources other than just like here's $20. But with, yeah, it's always been like do it together, because also we are learning as well. Like when we were installing our first shows, those were the first shows that we'd ever installed, even as practicing artists too, usually, or the second or the third. So it was like this learning process that we've always engaged with together. And yeah, that when you're involving other people, yeah, you do need this kind of sense of accountability and transparency, and just being very forthcoming, and also inscribing a bit of a difference, not to pull rank and be like, we are something that's lording over you, we are extracting value out of you, but like, you know, like if somebody sends me, Ben, an email, like maybe I will never respond. But like if somebody sends Hearth an email, maybe Ben will respond in a week or two, right? Like I'm beholden to what I've said that I can do. There's a little bit of like, that maybe is getting into like what is professional, is like, doesn't have anything necessarily to do with money or like a kind of linear definition of success, but it is like, I have professed that, that like I have publicly declared this is what I will do, and you better hold me to that, otherwise like we're both fucked, like, and because it's expensive, and like all of Hearth's programming is like very, very, and we're like striking the balance between like what is fast and what is rushed. It's like this is like very rapid. It's like rapid prototyping, but it's not rushed because we're finding out how to attune to like the dynamics of like the next to present, or like the very recent past and the very encroaching future. So yeah, and I like the model of the open call, because there is just so many people making so many things out there, and like I didn't go to art school, so I don't even know people from art school, and like you know, well, Rowan and Philip and Samin did, but that's still so small. That's such a small network of people that is established through students, and so I guess I even got involved with wanting to run a gallery at all because I felt like I was outside of the art school system. So that was my another initial tug towards that, was like, what would opening my doors in my life to receive so much beauty and weirdness, what would that look like? And so I think having the open call, even the people that we don't accept, we've been like, well, we didn't accept you, but it's not because we think that what you did was bad, and it just doesn't work because we can't accept everybody, and then offering them alternative feedback maybe, or like, what do you want to do? Do you want us to like help you write a grant? Because we can't have operational funding, so then we have to work off project grants. And it's like, oh, do you want us to edit your text? We can share you other places that may be looking for something. Like maybe this would be better suited for another gallery that we know of. So yeah, there's all of these strategies, I guess, but it isn't towards some end. It's really just like, yeah.
We have not experimented with the open call as a format. I'm open to it. I think, anyways, considering the landscape of arts funding right now in Canada, I think that a lot of that stuff's going to change. The way that we currently do it is, the first issue, we paid everything out of pocket for the production, and then we got 2 project grants for the following ones, which we were able to pay like over $20,000 to all the contributors, and I always thought that that was a wonderful thing, but realistically, that's probably also going to change. And like, you know, earlier I can, you know, talk all that stuff about, like, can you make art with no money? I mean, I don't know if you can publish or curate or program stuff without money. Obviously, there's overheads and production costs. But I think that the format of what this is right now, the conversation after 5 years of doing it, is probably shifting to thinking about other avenues, other things, being more amorphous. What I thought was kind of nice about some of the things that happened in this issue in particular is that like many of the artists in here kind of didn't go to art school, but started in some professional field and became like experts in something, and then sort of like hated the structure of like that workplace. Like I think about someone like Pippa Garner, for example, who like was parents or like came into this like field of doing like automotive design and like started to use those principles as a way of like changing their approach to thinking with sculpture, for example, or like making these cars that famously drove backwards across the Golden Gate Bridge. or other artists who started as electricians and then started making like light works, and like that being a way of like professionalizing is like literally you were a professional in a field and then you say like, I'm gonna like twist this thing and do something extremely unproductive, which is like make art. And now that I work in a university, like, and as a technician, it's, you know, the role is like, I don't do pedagogy. It's like a very clear distinction. UBC is a research institution, so if you're a visual arts faculty there, like you're expected to do artistic research, and like I also don't know what artistic research is, but it's to say that I don't do pedagogy. I do workshops, I do demos, I help people make stuff, and I do sometimes wonder about the differences, like the distinctions between that kind of format of education, like the idea of like the workshop versus like the idea of like the curriculum, like how those things are actually kind of sometimes antagonistic towards each other, and that generally sometimes I feel like artistic activity, like especially in those early, like before you've been totally indoctrinated into like institutional ways of being, that sometimes the artistic activity before you go to art school is like directly antagonistic towards institutions. So I don't really know what to make of the current landscape of like people doing their undergrad or like wanting to do their MFA right away, or like if you're in Europe now, like if you want to teach, you have to do a PhD in artistic research, and I don't know what that is either. Like I don't know what that means, or you know. There's this push towards, probably because of like profit incentives to, you know, to continue these needs upon artists to like participate in professional domains by like over-educating them or whatever. And it's not to say that institutions don't provide great support, like universities don't provide great support for, you know, doing kinds of research or projects, but also the pressures that I experience from my colleagues who are faculty members about like applying for shirt grants and dealing with like mental health issues of students, and then like, you know, dealing with curriculum and being like yelled at all the time, and then having like the department like do all this like bureaucratic obfuscation so that you like can't move forward or like do basic things, you know? It's like this kind of complication about like professionalizing as an artist today is, I don't know what it means. And that's, yeah, as I observe undergrad students today who just like come to school because they just like making things most of the time, you know, because they have some creative inclination, because they like to make drawings or like manga, or they like to, I don't know, sew or whatever, and then sometimes seeing them kind of like get all of that creative inclination hammered out of them because it has to be formalized in some way, I think is like kind of concerning. Yeah.
Maybe for our last question of the day, Ben, I think you made this observation that intertwined with professionalization is a question of legibility, specifically people, the public, looking at what you all do and trying to understand what it is. And in that process, there is this kind of reduction or simplification that has to happen. And of course, this is not all bad. Like we work in the public domain. I'm sure we all want people to see and engage and understand with what we do. But in the process, a lot is lost, right? Like there's this kind of wild, all these tendrils that have to be kind of compressed into an understandable notion of a curator, a collective, an artist, whatever it may be. Maybe you could speak to that process of legibility, like how, and this is to all of you, but Ben, since you kind of made the initial observation, how does legibility factor in to professionalization?
Right. Well, I guess legibility puts a lot of the onus of conferring an identity onto the one doing the observation, which is like what you said, basically. I'll just rephrase that. So, but I'm just thinking through this, which is like really unfortunate because it places everyone on this like trajectory. Like there's like an end goal that like you must inevitably like, or strive towards getting there, and if you do that, then like good job, and if you don't, then like you're a bad artist or something, which is terrible, and like is exactly that, a complete like radical foreclosing. Well, not a radical, because it's not even that deep. It's just like it's like a terrible and stupid foreclosing. It's like a really surface foreclosing of possibility. So like thinking of things in terms of like change always is like a way of like fighting against that, like that idea of professional, of the professionalist, something that is like somehow fundamentally linked to the structure that we're living inside of, the economic superstructure that we're living inside of. And I think that maybe like the type of professional that I would want to see is somebody who is like maybe trying to foster spaces where like yeah, but belonging can exist, and which has been mentioned previously as well. Like I thought that was a really good point, that kind of belonging approach, and like not even knowing what that belonging means yet. Because for me, I feel like so much of, like with even collectivity, like the what even collectivity presents me with is like, it's not so much even what's important is what's happening right now. It's like, what's going to happen next time we hang out? Like that is going to be even like that's going to be really cool. Like, and like, but even like even the possibility of there being a next time is something that is given to us by this idea of a collective, and like that is a beautiful thing, and that is what keeps me going. Is like this possibility, because like if there's not that, then like yeah, it's scary. So yeah, like maybe it's like an idea of like something ongoing. But that is different than legibility too, because you know, sometimes what you desire is your own undoing, and like moving forward, you can commit to that, and like that's still you enduring, even if you're not even you don't recognize yourself. But with the collective, I mean, kind of like what was talked about earlier too, about being in a band. It's like a Theseus ship thing maybe, where it's like all the original members are gone, but then the thing still goes forward, and then like everybody is like, oh, they're not the same. Like that's like, I miss the old Hearth. Yeah, it was good like after Ben left, and yeah, like Samin wrote all the texts only, and maybe like there was a shift, yeah, but maybe even like it could allow for a shift away from this kind of like cluster style, this kind of like hive rat king mode of working, towards more like defined roles maybe, but like it has to also allow for like moving away from that again too. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like Céline has this interesting relationship with legibility, where I feel like people that we work with and the artists we work with and our board and like our community members really understand what we're trying to do, and then we spent so much time trying to make ourselves legible to granting bodies, where we've like got so much feedback. Like our turnaround is quite quick, I think, which was mentioned before, which I think is responsive to the community that we're working with. We're not like choosing artists a year in advance. We're choosing artists like 4 months in advance. So we're applying for grants without the artists in place. And the granting bodies are really having trouble with that. They want names, they want to know who is going to be working with us, and that's just not like reasonable for who we are working with. We're working with a lot of artists who have just graduated from school. They're not, who knows what city they'll be in 2 years, you know? And also, like Hugo and I, we do not call ourselves curators. Like we have an exhibition at the end of our residency, but we're not curating it. We're just showcasing, you know, the artists that we're working with. And I think people have a trouble with understanding that we're not an exhibition space. And yeah, I don't know. It's like, I just invite people, like larger, more like commercial galleries in our city would be nice if they would come and see what we're doing, because then I think they would kind of get to understand like what we're about. But yeah, there feels like there's this disconnect that maybe it's okay, like it allows for flexibility in what we do, and like I don't actually want to be pinned down to one certain thing, but yeah, it would be nice to have this kind of sense of understanding.
I think it's a good point about yeah, the like applying for grants, about being so concrete. It feels like grants are not accessible to you unless all of the details are really stamped out. Even the like the what's the not concept to realization one? What's the other one? Research to creation grant. I'm just talking about like the individual specific ones. The details are so, they have to be so refined and so clear about whom, what, where, when, why, in a way that is obviously like not how things happen ever, right? So then we're all just we're all just kind of agreeing to sort of like lie about it throughout the process. But I guess that's just the way that the structure needs to be or something. It's not clear to me. I mean, I frankly just like even the artist bio or like the artist statement is a thing that I know is about legibility, and I know it's important, as are like didactic panels, but sometimes it's like rubbing sandpaper against your skin. Like it's just so, I don't know, it just feels like not, like I write an artist bio, and by the time I finished it, I just feel like it's just so, it's just so not me. Like I have no confidence in my ability to ever like anything for longer than any moment longer than, you know, like a month or something. And that tendency to like constantly have this like CV which is refined and like to be so clear about what it is that you do. Like, again, I'm talking about like art, maybe I'm like so art school pilled that like my brain is broken. And this thing about like what I like was formally taught to do in doing a BFA and then doing an MFA, and all the rules about what kind of works and what doesn't work. It's like there's so much that I keep out of my work. I'm like, there's so many parameters for how I don't include certain things in my artistic activity. And I think that sometimes the structures of like writing applications and like doing artist bios and artist statements are like another way of like corralling all of the things that I'm like defining what it is and what it isn't. And I don't know, it's just like a necessary evil, I guess, but like this negotiating the tension between legibility and complexity, I think is like, ultimately, it's like all complex and chaotic, and I sound so cynical today. I feel like generally I'm in a good mood. It's also cool. I don't know. It's cool to do. It's cool to do all these different things, and to be able to interact with all these different people, and to have these like very niche conversations with people like you, despite some of them think like trying to relate to the public. It's like so funny to have a conversation about like how to relate to the public. I like Ben's interpretation, like if you put the sandwich board out, nobody will come. Sometimes that's how it feels, you know? Anyway, yeah, sorry.
People don't read, like they just don't read.
Yeah, maybe that's like, maybe the artist statements and the bios are just for us, and the grant, like, and the didactic panels, like people sometimes like, what about, I know this is gonna sound so corny, but like sometimes beauty is like actually really important. Because it's like that's like the material. It's like the mediation of like how people experience art who are like not educated in like this like art school kind of way. You know, like they have to like they want to go into a gallery, they want to experience something that is beautiful, and sometimes that means a Damien Hirst, or sometimes it means some like student work or something. Like it's, you know, and what we think is like good or bad, or I don't know. It just feels like such a circular conversation.
Cynical guy from Vancouver. No, thank you, Felix. Let's jump into a Q&A. I am going to get...
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Well, they cut my mic? Jeez. It's just to say that, yeah, we are selling these things at the front. They're $30 each. We're also selling this brand new edition by the artist Catherine McTavish, who is in the building, who is an artist who lives here in Toronto. This is called Night Shift. It was originally a lithograph from 1979 that was produced while Catherine was working as a night clerk in a hospital. It's a really beautiful edition. It's also $30. It's a great stocking stuffer, or you can send it to your non-art interested family members. Yeah, that's my plug. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you, Elise and Ben. I'm going to get the audience mic, and then we can, if there's space for questions, it's been a lot, and or it's also
capacity.
Yeah.
maybe in the meantime, is there any folks in the panel who had questions for each other who I can pass a mic over to? Do you? No, okay. Any general questions from the audience?
It's my talk show moment.
Sorry.
I have a question, but for Chris and Parker. It's kind of a question, a self-reflection question. This whole kind of series of panels feels like a reflection of like a time, of a scene, and like maybe an archiving or record keeping, or many of us, I think in the room, like I recognize people who are mostly artists, but also who do other, like Space Maker and like Plumb members and peripheral review writers. Like, I guess my question is kind of like, what do you hope to come out of this exercise of thinking and talking? Because a lot of these are maybe private discussions that are just happening now in like a public recorded way. It's kind of a big question, but it's like, is the hope like a record keeping? Is the hope that it goes beyond the room and it's not only like 10 people doing things? Like I'm curious of like what happens with this.
Can I start? I'm going to start before hope, though. I don't know if I'm quite there yet. I think before hope also, like, in some ways this panel is like also precedented by a bunch of conversations that Parker and I have just had back and forth with each other, and I'm sure with a bunch of other people as well. And I think having those conversations, like, they're often spatialized. Maybe they're at a gallery, maybe they're like when you're meeting with like a single friend or something like that, but they're, I feel like, rarely kind of like externalized in the same way. And so maybe now trying to get to hope, one hope is like that there's just maybe some more space for this, or maybe it's even just like, okay, here are some faces that are thinking about these things, that are talking about them, and maybe you don't know these people, and you can come say hi to them afterwards and make a new friend. And that increases the kind of like range of the conversation. And I think also just like, it brings back to this, what did you say, Ben, this undoing of yourself. Because it's easy to kind of become insular in how you think through these notions of kind of like, I don't know, how the scene is operating around you, how things are changing, how there is or isn't space. And like, I don't know, I feel like I just have like a sappy, like, you just got to do shit with people.
Yeah, I definitely echo everything Chris said. I mean, I think also, and we talked about this a bit in the first event, but for Chris and I, these conversations feel like part of the important work of a practice to do. So, you know, what we recently applied for a grant for the program, and we used the kind of cringe term toolkit. But in documenting, creating a record, it does, on a very basic level, provide the opportunity for others to like, if they feel like this is part of the work they want to do, there's maybe a runway to see, to know how to do it more.
I want to riff one last thing off of that, because there's like an excess of discourse. Like, there's too much discourse sometimes. Like I don't know, I'm on the edge of PhD, and I feel like there's a part of me that's just like, it's just generating content, like that almost has no means and ends. But I feel like there's a lot of the way that discourse often gets positioned, it feels like, at least when it's like about an individual artist, is like in relationship to their individual practice. And I think there's an important way of thinking about the discourse of like what sustains our practice, or like what's even maybe more, I don't know, I say like primordial than the practice itself, which is like the social relations, the economic context, and I don't know, like people's belief and aspirations, and well, and their own hopes. I don't know. Not my hopes.
Yeah, one last thing. I mean, the video that was playing before the first panel started was just like a still, static shot of a photograph that was taken a couple months ago for the 5-year anniversary of Pumice Raft. And I really wanted to, I think like the politics of visibility is something that I'm really invested in, and just seeing, like showing the people's faces, showing how many people are involved is just so important alongside what is produced. Like it's like, there's so many people that have to exist and come together to make this happen. And this event is very similar to that. Like it's yeah, let's try and bring everyone together and just like look at them. They're doing the work. Like it's important. Other questions?
Thank you. I've been thinking about the word legacy throughout the different panels. Legacy in terms of creating a mandate within an institutional context, also in creating a collection, something to resist against as well, and also creating a next time and a next time, and also as a recuperative act. And this conversation as being something that has felt like it's building legacy and looking back and what's been disappearing, and also connecting to creating a record and archive to this. So not so much a question, but, or if anyone has any reflections upon that.
And if anyone from the other panels wants to reflect on that, I can give you the mic. Thank you.
I could say something quickly. Yeah. I just, artist-run culture, especially in its early iterations, I think is like so inherently ephemeral, which I think is like really beautiful about it. That, you know, that it was just about people sort of like sitting in a room on the floor together or whatever, and like getting messy. And of course that's changed over time because, as some people pointed out so skillfully, like you get older and then all of a sudden you're like, who's paying the rent again? And like, we need a treasurer and a, you know, like that's just, I guess, the natural progression of certain things. But I think like the ephemerality of certain kinds of art spaces and like our activity as people who work in these different roles, or like who run things or publish things or whatever, like ultimately it's like certainly not forever. And legacy, I mean, it's great to document all of those things, but I don't know, I'm just thinking about letting go. Sometimes knowing when to stop, I guess, is also probably pretty good. But like the band analogy is probably pretty awesome. Yeah.
I really liked what you were talking about, Felix, in terms of like kind of stealing back time, or stealing things literally from where you work. And it just made me think about like contextualizing the starting of Blinkers too. Like one of my collaborators was like working at American Apparel, and it went under while we were starting, and we literally got all of our fluorescent lighting from American Apparel. Like we were like, it's going somewhere, might as well take it. And like my friend was working at the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, and one of their techs like gave us all this like extra baseboards, and like everything was just kind of like essentially taken from our workplaces in a really kind of cool way. But I like thinking of that as like more a framework of actually like intentional, instead in thinking about it intentionally rather than just like randomly. So I like that you said that.
I also want to speak to your point about like this professionalization and how it's becoming like a bit ridiculous maybe. Something that like we experience in PEI a lot, I think, is that like it's hard to actually like gain the like credentials on your CV to like get to a space where you can actually show in these like bigger city centers. And like I think a part of that is because of like the lack of resources that we have, so it's like hard to actually build that like experience that people are looking for. And so like things like your project that are looking at people who are, you know, not within this context or are completely new to this context, I think is like something that's super important for us to be doing. But I also think it's just kind of like a funny thing. It's like, I don't know, I don't think any of us got into art to like write papers or, you know, send emails or be a treasurer, but yet we do all these things. And yeah, it's like, I don't know how we can exist in other ways, but I would like to find a way, because it can be stifling to like, you know, have to basically like run a business instead of being an artist, you know?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but I'm kind of just phrasing a word. I think a lot of the work, like, of balancing all these certain things with being professional, being an artist, running a space, is like this idea of sacrifice that I've been kind of struggling with. I find that, like, juggling things and having to switch all the time, like, I find myself missing things or feeling like I'm missing things and then getting caught up in that. And so it's not, again, not really a question, but this idea of sacrifice and how, like, maybe that's kind of pessimistic, but there's like a lot of things to gain with the work, but it's always like, I feel like you're always pulled in different directions, or there's like some sort of idea of sacrifice within like my own identity, like what am I working on and stuff like that.
Maybe I'll just riff on that quickly. Like maybe another version of sacrifice could be service, right? Like that was a surprising element of running a space to me, was like how much of a service component there is, whether it's like to the artists you're working with, collaborators, but also the public, beyond anything that is actually output, but just like the service function. And really that goes back to like one of the main aims of the Artist Run Center is that they're service organizations. I don't know, that not much more to say on that.
Okay. One last call for questions. If anyone has anything they're really dying to say. No? Okay. Well, big thank you for everyone for coming out today. Thank you so much for also staying for so long. I wish I had something to give you in exchange, like a little patch or something, like a Scouts patch or something. Yeah, so I just want to say a big thank you to all our panelists today, and to, of course, so I'll just name them all. So Theresa, Lillian, Yasmin, Ben, Elise, Felix, Hannah, Evan, and Patrick, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, your wisdom. Thanks also to Miles, Jordan, Adrian, Brittany, who's no longer here, for documenting and audio and all of that. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some extra stuff. Parker?
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Also, I'll just plug that Kamias Triennial does have an exhibition on right now, a solo show by Douglas Watt, a Vancouver-based artist, our enemy.
Trying to get van-pilled.
Gallery hours are open tomorrow from 12 to 5. Please come by. And stay tuned for details of the third and final event of this series. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.